Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, March 14, 1862, 11:47 in the morning. Inside the marble halls of the Academy of Natural Sciences, where specimen jars line walls like trophies of conquest and the air tastes of formaldehyde and empire, 7 white men in tailcoats gather around a single black woman, as though she were a creature pulled from the depths of an uncharted sea. They do not speak to her. They speak about her. She stands beneath the skylight, silent, her shadow stretching long across the polished floor, and in her eyes burns something none of their instruments can measure, a fury older than their science, a dignity sharper than their scalpels. Her name is Harriet Stone. Though the men will misspell it, mispronounce it, reduce it to a footnote in their journals that will gather dust for a century. She has come here not by choice but by necessity, a bargain struck in desperation, a door opened by curiosity that conceals a cage. These men, these so-called naturalists, anthropologists, racial theorists with their calipers and measuring tapes, have built careers on the fiction that humanity can be divided, ranked, and catalogued like beetles pinned to cork. But Harriet Stone's very existence shatters their taxonomies. Her features, her skin, her hair, they defy every category, every theory, suggests every pseudo-scientific chart they have drawn to justify an empire built on stolen bodies and broken spirits. And so they study her not to understand but to contain, not to see, but to conquer. This is the story of a woman who became a ghost in her own time, documented but never heard, measured but never seen, turned into evidence for a trial she was never allowed to testify in. What you are about to witness is not merely history. It is archaeology of violence, the unearthing of a moment when science wore the mask of enlightenment while serving the machinery of enslavement and erasure. If you believe that some stories must be told not because they comfort us, but because they remind us of the price of our silences, then stay. Subscribe to bear witness. Comment to resurrect the voices they tried to bury. Because Harriet Stone's story is not just her own. It is the story of every person who was ever studied, catalogued, and dehumanized in the name of progress. And it begins here in this room, suggests where a woman stands alone against the empire of the rational, armed with nothing but her refusal to disappear. Harriet Stone had walked through the doors of the Academy of Natural Sciences at dawn, when the city was still cloaked in the gray exhaustion of winter and the streets held only the footsteps of lamplighters and washerwomen. She had not come alone. Beside her walked a white physician named Dr. Samuel George Morton, a man whose name would one day be synonymous with the corruption of science in service of supremacy, though in this moment he wore the guise of objective inquiry. Morton had discovered Harriet 3 months prior in a boarding house on Lombard Street, in the heart of Philadelphia's black community, where she worked mending clothes and taking in laundry to survive. What had drawn his attention was not her labor but her appearance, a face that seemed to mock every theory he had spent his career constructing. Her skin held tones that shifted in different lights, neither the categories he had assigned to African peoples nor those he had reserved for Europeans or indigenous Americans. Her hair fell in patterns that defied his collections of samples, just mounted and labeled in his private study like specimens of flora. Her cheekbones, her nose, her lips, each feature seemed to belong to a different chapter in his unpublished manuscript on racial hierarchies, and together they formed a living contradiction to everything he claimed to know. Morton had approached her with an offer wrapped in the language of scientific contribution and financial compensation. $20, nearly 2 months' wages. For a single day of examination, he had promised dignity, discretion, a contribution to the advancement of human knowledge. What he had not told her was that 6 other prominent natural scientists, phrenologists, and racial anatomists would be present. What he had not mentioned was that their findings would be published, debated, circulated through lecture halls and medical schools across a nation tearing itself apart over the question of whether people who looked like her were even fully human. Harriet had accepted not because she believed his promises, but because her daughter, 8 years old, named Grace, with her mother's mysterious beauty and her mother's uncertain place in a world obsessed with classification, needed medicine that cost more than dignity. And so she had walked through those doors at dawn, her spine straight, her face a mask of composure, knowing that she was entering a theater where she would be both specimen and ghost, present but unseen. A body without a voice in a room full of men who believed themselves the architects of truth. The 7 men who awaited her represented the vanguard of what 19th century America called enlightenment, though their enlightenment had teeth, suggests, and those teeth were sunk deep into the flesh of empire. There was Dr. Samuel George Morton himself, the collector of skulls, a man who had amassed over 1,000 human crania in his private museum, measuring them obsessively to prove that brain size determined intellectual capacity and that white Europeans possessed the largest, most developed minds. Beside him stood Dr. Josiah Clark Knott, a physician from Mobile, Alabama, whose medical practice served plantation owners and whose writings argued that different races were actually different species, incapable of producing fertile offspring, a theory slavery's defenders quoted like scripture. In the corner, adjusting his brass calipers with the precision of a jeweler, sat Louis Agassiz, the Swiss-born naturalist whose revulsion at seeing enslaved Africans in Philadelphia had transformed from personal disgust into scientific doctrine. His lectures at Harvard declaring that races had been created separately, in different geographic cradles, destined by divine design for different stations. George Glidden, an Egyptologist who had made his fortune giving lectures with mummies as props, stood near the window smoking a pipe, his presence lending the veneer of ancient authority to modern prejudice. Dr. Charles Caldwell, a physician-philosopher from Kentucky, had brought his phrenological charts, elaborate diagrams mapping the skull's surface into territories of moral character, intellect, and propensity for violence, each bump and depression supposedly revealing the soul's landscape. Professor John Bachman, a Lutheran minister and naturalist, represented the theological wing of racial science, believing he could reconcile scripture with hierarchy, jests, proving that unity of human origin did not mean equality of human capacity. And finally, there was Dr. Peter Brown, a lawyer turned anatomist whose specialty was hair. He had collected samples from every race he could identify, suggests, mounting them on slides, studying their cross-sections under primitive microscopes, convinced that hair structure revealed essential differences in human worth. These men did not see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as pioneers, as brave truth-tellers willing to speak the uncomfortable facts that sentimentalists and abolitionists refused to acknowledge. They had titles, university positions, published works, invitations to lecture before Congress. Their science would be cited in Supreme Court decisions taught in medical schools, used to justify laws that would endure for generations. And on this March morning, they had gathered to confront their anomaly, Harriet Stone, the woman whose body refused to confirm their conclusions, whose existence was an inconvenient question mark in their declarative sentences about human difference. The examination began with silence. A silence that had weight, texture. The oppressive quality of held breath before violence. Morton gestured for Harriet to stand in the center of the room, directly beneath the skylight where the late morning sun fell in a pale column, suggests, illuminating her as though she were already a museum exhibit, already dead and mounted for posterity. She complied, her movements deliberate, her face arranged in an expression of careful neutrality that black women in America had perfected over generations. The mask that revealed nothing, that gave these men no ammunition, no excuse, no satisfaction. Knott approached first, circling her slowly, his eyes moving over her body with the detached assessment of a livestock trader at auction. He did not ask permission before reaching out to touch her hair, his fingers probing the texture, separating strands, jests, holding them up to the light as though they were threads of evidence in a trial whose verdict had already been decided. Harriet did not flinch. She had learned long ago that flinching gave men like this a sense of power they craved more than breath. Agassiz stood at a distance, making notes in a leather-bound journal, his handwriting precise and slanted, German-influenced. He sketched her profile with swift, assured strokes, reducing her face to angles and proportions, geometry stripped of humanity. Remarkable, he murmured, though whether in admiration or disturbance was unclear. The nasal index is entirely inconsistent with sub-Saharan classification, yet the prognathism suggests no, jests, contradicts. He trailed off, frustrated, his pencil hovering over paper as though the drawing itself were lying to him. Glidden stepped forward with a device, a headspan measuring tool, cold metal shaped like mechanical hands, and positioned it against Harriet's skull. The instrument's arms extended, contracting, calibrating the circumference of her cranium while she stood motionless, her breathing shallow and controlled. Larger than the Negro average, Glidden announced, consulting Morton's published charts. But the shape, the cephalic index, doesn't correspond to Caucasian norms either. Caldwell produced his phrenological instruments next, running his fingers over Harriet's scalp with clinical pressure, feeling for the bumps and depressions he believed mapped character and capability. His touch was impersonal but invasive, a violation disguised as methodology. Organoveneration well developed, he noted, firmness prominent, destructiveness subdued as expected in the domesticated Negro female. Harriet's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Domesticated. The word hung in the air like smoke. She thought of Grace, waiting at home, feverish and frightened, and she held her tongue. She held everything. She became stone in truth, unrateable and ancient. While these men tried to crack her open with their instruments of certainty, the measurements concluded, but the men's confusion only deepened, and with confusion came argument, sharp, heated. The kind of intellectual combat that reveals how fragile certainty becomes when confronted with complexity. Morton stood at his makeshift desk, surrounded by charts and diagrams, suggests. Comparing Harriet's recorded measurements against his published standards, his face growing increasingly troubled. She defies every category, he admitted, his voice tight with frustration. The cranial capacity suggests European admixture. Yet the facial angle measurements indicate something else entirely. She is neither one thing nor another. Not scoffed, his Alabama drawl cutting through the room like a blade. Then she is proof of hybrid degeneration, Morton. When races mix, they produce these anomalies, sterile, confused biological contradictions. She is the evidence we need that miscegenation produces inferior stock, suggests mongrels who belong to no race and therefore to no proper station in civilized society. But Bachman, the minister naturalist, shook his head vigorously, his religious convictions colliding with his scientific ones. No, not. That cannot be. Scripture tells us all humans descend from Adam, from Noah's sons after the flood. This woman is not a separate creation, not a hybrid abomination. She is simply a variation within the species. Perhaps evidence that environmental factors influence physical characteristics more than we have acknowledged. The theological interpretation infuriated Agassiz, who slammed his journal shut with a crack that made everyone turn. Bachman, your biblical literalism blinds you to observable reality. This woman is not a variation. She is a categorical impossibility if we accept the standard racial classifications. Either our classifications are wrong, which I refuse to believe, suggest, or she represents something we have not yet properly named, a fifth race perhaps, or a sixth, some lineage that does not fit our current understanding. Glidden lit another pipe, the tobacco smoke curling upward like incense in a temple of false gods. Or perhaps, he offered, his tone patronizing, she is simply mixed beyond recognition. Multiple generations of amalgamation, African and European and perhaps indigenous, suggests, until the bloodlines become so confused that no pure characteristics remain. She is the chaos that results when natural boundaries are violated, when races meant to remain separate are allowed to intermingle. Peter Brown, silent until now, suggests help several strands of Harriet's hair mounted on a glass slide. Her hair structure shows characteristics I have never documented. Under magnification, the shaft diameter varies in ways that match neither Caucasian nor Negro nor Mongolian samples. Gentlemen, we are not looking at a woman who defies our categories. We are looking at a woman who exposes our categories as insufficient. And then, for the first time since entering that room of marble and malice, Harriet Stone spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it carried low, steady, suggests, edged with a steel these men had not anticipated because they had never thought to anticipate anything from her at all. You speak of me as though I am not here, she said, her eyes moving from face to face, holding each gaze just long enough to make them uncomfortable. You measure my skull as though it were a coconut shell. You debate my blood as though it were a chemistry experiment. You argue about what I am, where I belong. What box in your little charts can contain me? But not one of you has asked me who I am. Not one of you has considered that perhaps your science is not insufficient. Perhaps it is simply wrong. The room fell into a stunned silence. Morton's face flushed red, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. Knott's expression hardened into contempt, his hand instinctively moving toward his walking stick as though he might need it as a weapon. But Harriet continued, jests, her composure unbroken, her words measured and deliberate. My mother was born in Haiti, in the mountains where the revolution was won while your grandfathers were still writing constitutions about freedom they did not mean. My father was a ship captain from Lisbon who loved her enough to defy every law that said he should not. My grandmother on my mother's side was Taino from the islands your people emptied and renamed. My grandfather was from the Mandinka, brought in chains to a sugar-cane field where he lived long enough to teach his daughter that she was not what slavers called her. She took a step forward, and remarkably, several of the men took a step back. I am not your anomaly, jests. I am not your evidence. I am not your contradiction. I am a woman with a name, with a daughter, with a history you cannot measure because your instruments were designed to prove a conclusion, not to discover truth. You want to classify me because if you cannot classify me, then everything you have built, your charts, your lectures, your laws, your entire architecture of who deserves freedom and who deserves chains, falls apart. And that terrifies you. Not because you fear being wrong, but because you fear what being wrong would cost you. Agassiz slammed his hand on the table, his Swiss accent thickening with rage. This is intolerable. Morton, you brought an insolent, educated Negro into a scientific inquiry. She has been taught to speak above her station, to question her betters. This contaminates the entire proceeding. Morton's face had gone pale. Just, his hands trembling slightly as he removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a handkerchief. A nervous gesture, a retreat into ritual when confronted with the collapse of certainty. Mrs. Stone, he said, his voice strained. Attempting to reassert control through forced civility, you misunderstand the nature of this inquiry. We are not your enemies. We seek only to understand the natural world, to document the diversity of human forms, to contribute to knowledge that will benefit all mankind. But even as he spoke the words, they sounded hollow, rehearsed, the kind of justification a man offers himself in the mirror when he knows he has compromised something essential. He had built his reputation on objectivity, on the cold purity of measurement and data, but standing before Harriet Stone, hearing her speak with such clarity and dignity, he felt for the first time the terrible weight of what his objectivity had been used to justify. He thought of the skulls in his collection, over 1,000 of them, purchased, traded, stolen from graves, taken from battlefields, acquired from medical students who robbed cemeteries under cover of darkness. Each skull had once held a mind, a consciousness, a person with a name and a history. He had reduced them all to numbers, cubic inches of cranial capacity. Measurements entered into ledgers, averages calculated to prove that some humans were more human than others. He had published those findings. Plantation owners quoted him in legislative debates, His work had been cited in court cases denying citizenship, defending slavery, restricting rights, and he had told himself it was just science, just data, just the pursuit of truth wherever it led, But what if the truth he had pursued was simply the truth he had needed to find? What if every measurement had been a predetermined conclusion dressed in the costume of inquiry? Harriet watched him, and in her eyes he saw something worse than anger. He saw pity. She pitied him. This black woman standing in his academy, measured and catalogued like a botanical specimen, felt sorry for him. The realization was unbearable. You may go, he said abruptly, reaching into his coat pocket and withdrawing a small leather purse. He counted out $20 in bills and coins, placing them on the table rather than handing them to her directly, maintaining that final distance, that last barrier between subject and object. Our examination is complete. You have fulfilled your obligation. But they both knew nothing was complete, something had been broken here that measurements could not repair, a crack in the foundation of his certainty that would widen with time until the entire structure collapsed. Harriet collected the money without haste, her fingers careful and deliberate as she counted each bill, each coin, ensuring she received exactly what had been promised, not out of distrust, though distrust would have been justified, but out of a practiced vigilance that came from living in a world where people like her were cheated as casually as they were breathing. She folded the bills precisely, placed them in the small cloth purse she wore beneath her shawl. And then she did something none of the men expected. She smiled. It was not a warm smile, not friendly or forgiving. It was the smile of someone who has seen through a performance, who understands the machinery behind the curtain, who knows that the emperor's fine robes are nothing but expensive thread draped over ordinary flesh. Gentlemen, she said, the word itself an irony so sharp it could draw blood, I hope your science brings you comfort. I hope your measurements help you sleep at night. I hope when you publish your findings and give your lectures and teach your students, you remember this moment. Remember the woman who stood here and refused to be the proof you needed. She turned toward the door, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor, each step a small act of reclamation, a taking back of space these men believed belonged exclusively to them. But before she reached the threshold, Peter Brown called out, his voice uncertain, almost plaintive. Mrs. Stone, wait, please. She paused but did not turn around. Brown approached slowly, holding something in his hand, the glass slide with her hair samples mounted on it. I would like to return these to you, he said quietly so the others could not hear. It does not feel right keeping them. Jester, you are not a specimen. You were never a specimen. Harriet looked at the slide, at her own hair trapped under glass, reduced to an object of study, and she shook her head. Keep it, she said. Let it remind you, suggests. Let it be the evidence that haunts you when you try to convince yourself that science has no conscience, that measurement carries no moral weight. That strand of hair came from a woman with a daughter who needs medicine. It came from a body that feels pain, from a mind that thinks, from a heart that loves. Whatever you do with it, it will always be more than data. She left then, walking out of the Academy of Natural Sciences into the cold Philadelphia morning, suggests the door closing behind her with a finality that sounded like judgment. Inside, the 7 men stood in silence, their instruments scattered on tables, jests, their charts and diagrams suddenly seeming less like maps of truth and more like elaborate fictions they had drawn to justify a world built on cruelty. The silence that followed Harriet Stone's departure was not peaceful. It was the silence of men confronting a mirror they had not asked to look into, and finding their reflections distorted by truths they had spent careers avoiding. Knott was the first to break it, his voice sharp with defensive anger. Well, that was a spectacular waste of time and money. The woman is clearly educated beyond her natural capacity, filled with abolitionist propaganda, taught to parrot arguments she does not truly understand. This is what happens when Negroes are allowed to read, suggests when they are given ideas above their station. They become confused, agitated, unable to accept their proper place in the natural order. He gathered his papers with violent efficiency, shoving them into his leather satchel. I will note in my report that the subject was compromised, unsuitable for objective study due to external ideological contamination. The measurements, however, remain valid and support my thesis on hybrid degeneration. Agassiz nodded in agreement, though his expression remained troubled, as if some part of him recognized the intellectual dishonesty in dismissing evidence simply because it contradicted preferred conclusions. The measurements are what matter, he said more to himself than to the others. Personal opinions, emotional outbursts. These are irrelevant to science. We document what is observable, quantifiable. Her skull dimensions, her hair structure, her facial angles, these are facts independent of whatever she believes about herself. But even as he spoke, his hand moved unconsciously to his journal, where he had sketched her face, and he found himself staring at the drawing, at the eyes he had rendered with perhaps too much precision, too much life. On paper, she looked back at him with that same unsettling intelligence, that same quiet defiance, and he closed the journal quickly, as if shutting away something dangerous. Morton had not moved from his position by the window, staring out at Broad Street where morning traffic had begun to fill the cobblestones. Carriages, pedestrians, the ordinary flow of a city going about its business, oblivious to the crisis of certainty occurring in this marble hall. Gentlemen, he said finally, his voice hollow, I propose we do not publish these findings. The room erupted in protest. Glidden sputtered, not publish? Morton, this is precisely the kind of anomalous case that demands documentation. But Morton shook his head slowly. No, I do not think we can publish this, not because the measurements are invalid, but because I do not know what they mean anymore. And I will not contribute to knowledge I am no longer certain is knowledge at all. The room divided then, not along scientific lines, but along the fault lines of conscience and investment, just between those who sensed the ground shifting beneath their certainties, and those who would cling to their theories even as the evidence burned them. Caldwell laughed, a bitter, contemptuous sound. So the great Samuel Morton loses his nerve. One articulate negress speaks out of turn, and suddenly decades of research mean nothing. This is precisely the weakness that undermines our cause, this sentimentality disguised as rigor. The South needs men of science who will stand firm in the face of abolitionist sentimentality, not scholars who crumble at the first emotional appeal. He gathered his phrenological charts with deliberate precision, rolling them tightly. I will publish my findings independently. The cranial formations I documented today support every conclusion I have drawn about racial hierarchies. If you lack the courage to defend truth, Morton, others will do so without you. Bachman stepped between them, his minister's instinct for mediation surfacing despite his own conflicted loyalties. Perhaps we need time to reflect, to consider what we have observed today in light of broader theological and scientific frameworks. Mrs. Stone raised questions that deserve serious consideration, not emotional rejection, Caldwell, but genuine intellectual engagement. If our classifications cannot account for her, perhaps our classifications require refinement, not abandonment. But not cut him off with a dismissive wave. Refinement. Bachman, you always seek compromise where none exists. The woman is mixed race, probably across 3 or 4 generations, which produces exactly this kind of biological confusion. She is not a challenge to our system. She is confirmation of what happens when natural boundaries are violated. Jests. I will include her case in my next lecture series as evidence of amalgamation's degenerative effects. Peter Brown still held the glass slide, turning it over in his hands, watching how light passed through Harriet's hair under the mounting medium. I measured her hair structure with the same instruments I have used on hundreds of samples, he said quietly. The results do not match any category I have established. Not because the measurements are wrong, but because the categories themselves may be insufficient. Agassiz turned on him sharply. Insufficient. Brown, we have spent years developing those categories, correlating them with geographic origin, with intellectual capacity, with moral character. You would discard all of that because one woman presents an unusual combination of features? Brown looked up, meeting Agassiz's eyes. No. I would question whether any combination of features should ever have been used to determine a human being's worth. But the silence that followed was different, colder, more final. They had crossed a line. Some toward doubt, suggest others toward deeper entrenchment. The Academy of Natural Sciences had become a house divided, and Harriet Stone, already gone, had been the earthquake. Outside, Harriet walked through Philadelphia as though moving through a city that existed in two places at once. The physical streets of 1862, where spring struggled to break through winter's grip, and the war between North and South had turned the nation's attention toward distant battlefields, jests, and the invisible architecture of surveillance and judgment that black people navigated every day like sailors reading dangerous waters. She passed white shopkeepers who watched her from doorways with suspicion, calculating whether she might be free or fugitive, whether her fine posture and careful dress indicated education and employment or presumption and theft. She passed black dock workers and laundresses who nodded in recognition, acknowledging the shared burden of visibility, the exhausting performance of respectability required just to move through public space without incident. The $20 in her purse felt heavy, not with the weight of coins but with the weight of what she had traded for them, her body as evidence, her existence as debate, her humanity as hypothesis. The war had changed Philadelphia in subtle ways. More women wore mourning clothes now, black crepe and veils marking the absent men, the sons and husbands sent to battlefields whose names appeared in newspapers like Incantations Bull Run, Shiloh, Fort Donelson. President Lincoln had issued no emancipation yet. That would come later in the year, but the possibility hung in the air like smoke, and with it came both hope and terror. Hope that slavery might finally end, that the nation might be forced to reckon with the contradiction at its heart. Terror that even if slavery ended, the men like those she had just left behind would find new ways to measure, classify, and subordinate, would transform chains of iron into chains of pseudoscience and law. Freedom, Harriet understood, was not simply the absence of slavery. It was the right to exist without justification, to walk through the world without being examined, to love your child without wondering if her mysterious beauty would become a curse in a society obsessed with purity and categorization. She turned onto Lombard Street, suggests, where the black community had built something remarkable in the margins the city had allowed them: churches, mutual aid societies, schools where children learned to read despite laws in neighboring states that made such education a crime. Here, so she was not an anomaly. Here she was Harriet, a widow, a mother, a seamstress with skilled hands, a woman whose mixed heritage was not a biological puzzle but a family history, a story of survival and love across boundaries that empires had drawn but human hearts had refused to honor. The boarding house where Harriet lived stood 3 stories tall, narrow and weathered, its brick facade darkened by coal smoke and time. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, her legs heavy now that the performance of composure was no longer required, now that she could allow herself to feel the violation of those hours in the academy, the hands in her hair, through the cold metal against her skull, the clinical detachment in voices discussing her body as though she were livestock or landscape. She unlocked the door to find Grace asleep on the narrow bed they shared. Her small body curled beneath quilts that Harriet had sewn from fabric scraps, each patch a different texture and color, a map of their survival. The fever had broken. Harriet could tell by the color in her daughter's cheeks, the peaceful rhythm of her breathing, the way her hands lay relaxed rather than clenched. Mrs. Whitfield from downstairs had kept watch as promised, and had left a note on the table. Favor broke around noon. She asked for you. Ate some broth. Resting peaceful now, Harriet sank into the room's single chair, every muscle in her body releasing tension she had held for hours. She counted the money again, spreading it on the table. $20. Enough for the medicine Grace needed. Jests, enough for rent through next month, enough for food and coal, and perhaps, if she was careful, enough to save a little toward the future she was trying to build. But the cost. God, the cost. She thought of those men studying her, debating her, reducing her existence to measurements and theories. She thought of Peter Brown's guilty eyes when he offered to return her hair. Jests. She thought of Morton's trembling hands and Knott's contemptuous sneer and Agus's furious insistence that his categories could not be wrong. They would publish or they would not publish. They would argue among themselves about what she meant, what she represented, how she fit or did not fit into their taxonomies of human worth. And none of it would change the fact that she had to stand there and let them do it, had to trade her dignity for her daughter's health. Jests had to become an object so that Grace could remain a child. Grace stirred then, her eyes opening slowly, focusing on her mother with the perfect trust that children have before the world teaches them otherwise. "Mama," she whispered, suggests, her voice still rough from fever. "Did you get the medicine?" Harriet crossed to the bed, kneeling beside it, smoothing her daughter's hair with infinite gentleness. "Yes, baby. I got everything we need. Pause here, if you will." Jests. In this moment between violation and vengeance, between submission and resurrection, what you are witnessing is not merely one woman's story, but the architecture of a system, a machine that runs on the theft of bodies, the cataloging of souls, the reduction of human complexity to numbers that justify empires. Harriet Stone stood in that academy and became legend not through compliance but through refusal. Jests not through silence but through speech that shattered the illusion of objectivity these men had built their careers upon. If this story moves you, if it makes you rage against the pseudoscience that poisoned generations, then subscribe. Become a witness who refuses to let such histories dissolve into footnotes. Comment below with the names of those erased by measurement and theory. Share this, Jests, because some truths are too dangerous to be left in archives gathering dust. Harriet's reckoning has only begun. The men who studied her believed they could contain her in their classifications. They were wrong. What comes next is how a woman measured becomes a woman mythic, how silence transforms into thunder, how one day in March 1862 echoes across centuries. The medicine worked. Within 3 days, Grace was running through the boarding house hallways again, her laughter echoing off narrow walls, her body restored to the resilient vitality of childhood. But something in Harriet had changed in that marble hall. Something fundamental and irreversible. She had walked into the academy as a woman trying to survive, willing to endure humiliation for $20 and her daughter's health. She walked out as something else, a woman who had seen the machinery of oppression from the inside, who had stood at the center of the intellectual apparatus that justified slavery and subordination. Suggests who had heard educated men argue about her humanity as though it were a debatable proposition, and she had spoken back. That was the transformation. Not the measurement, not the examination, not the violation, but the refusal to remain silent. The decision to name what was happening, to reject the role of passive specimen and claim the authority of her own voice. Word spread through Philadelphia's black community about what had happened at the academy. Mrs. Whitfield told her sister, who told the women at Mother Bethel AMM Church, who told their husbands and brothers and sons. Within a week, Harriet found herself sitting in a basement meeting room on Lombard Street, surrounded by 30 people who wanted to hear her story. Not the measurements, not the scientific details, but what it felt like to be studied like an insect, what those men had said, how she had responded. Among them were ministers, teachers, abolitionists, free black men and women who had built lives and families in the precarious space between slavery and full citizenship. They understood immediately what Harriet had experienced because they lived under the same gaze every day. The scrutiny that questioned their capacity for civilization, their fitness for freedom, their right to exist without justification. Reverend William Alston, pastor of Mother Bethel, sat with his hands folded, listening intently. Jests. When Harriet finished speaking, he nodded slowly. "Sister Stone, you have given us something precious. You have given us testimony, not from a courtroom, not from a pulpit, but from inside their temple of science itself." Jests. "You have seen how they make their lies look like truth, how they dress hatred in the costume of reason. And you have shown us that their power is fragile, that it shatters when we refuse to accept the stories they tell about us." He leaned forward, Jests, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Now we must decide what to do with this testimony, What emerged from that basement meeting was not a petition or a protest in the traditional sense, jests, but something more dangerous to the architecture of racial science, a counter-narrative, a systematic dismantling of the Academy's authority through the circulation of Harriet's story in abolitionist newspapers, church bulletins, jests, and the underground networks that connected free black communities across the North. Reverend Alston knew editors at The Liberator and Frederick Douglass's paper Douglass Monthly. Within 2 weeks, Harriet's account appeared in print, not as scientific data but as human testimony, a first-person narrative that described the examination from her perspective, naming the men involved, quoting their words, exposing the assumptions that undergirded their methodology. Suggests the article was titled, "I Was Studied Like an Animal, a Black Woman's Account of Racial Science in Philadelphia," and it spread like fire through abolitionist circles, reprinted in papers from Boston to Chicago, read aloud at anti-slavery meetings, circulated among free black communities who saw in Harriet's experience a mirror of their own daily humiliations. The response from the scientific establishment was swift and furious. Jests. Morton received letters from colleagues accusing him of allowing a subject to compromise the integrity of their research. Knott published a rebuttal claiming Harriet's account was fabricated by abolitionists, that she was likely illiterate and incapable of producing such sophisticated prose, that the entire article was propaganda designed to undermine legitimate scientific inquiry. Agassiz, in a lecture at Harvard, dismissed the controversy as evidence of how emotion and politics were contaminating natural science, insisting that measurement and classification were neutral tools, value, free methods that revealed truth regardless of who wielded them. But the damage was done. For the first time, the public was hearing the other side of racial science, not from white abolitionists speaking on behalf of black humanity, but from a black woman speaking for herself, describing what it felt like to be the object rather than the subject of knowledge, to be data rather than persons. Churches across Philadelphia began organizing what they called testimony evenings, where Harriet and others would share their experiences with scientific racism, medical exploitation, and the daily indignities of living under the gaze of a society obsessed with measuring and ranking human worth. These gatherings became powerful acts of resistance, spaces where black people could name their reality, challenge the narratives constructed about them, and build collective understanding of how pseudoscience served political oppression. Harriet had become, without intending it, suggests a symbol, the woman who had been measured and refused to be diminished. But symbols make enemies, and enemies with institutional power are dangerous. By late April 1862, Harriet began noticing men watching her boarding house, white men in dark coats who stood across the street pretending to read newspapers, who followed her when she walked to the market, who asked her landlord questions about her character, jests her visitors, her political affiliations. She recognized the tactics: intimidation dressed as inquiry, surveillance designed to isolate and frighten. The landlord, Mr. Chen, a Chinese immigrant who had his own reasons to distrust authority, jests, warned her quietly one evening. Men came today, asked if you meet with abolitionists, if you receive mail from out of state, if you speak against the Union. I told them nothing, but Mrs. Stone, they are building a file on you. Be careful. The war had given the government new powers to suppress dissent, and abolitionist activity, especially black abolitionist activity, was being watched closely under the guise of national security. Then came the legal assault. Jests. Josiah, not furious that his scientific authority had been challenged by a black woman's testimony, filed a lawsuit claiming Harriet had violated a confidentiality agreement by speaking publicly about the examination. It was a fabrication. No such agreement had existed, but the lawsuit itself was the weapon, not its merits. It forced Harriet to find legal representation, to spend money she did not have, suggests, to appear in court where her word would be weighed against the testimony of prominent white physicians. The abolitionist community rallied, raising funds for her defense, connecting her with lawyers who worked for the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society. But the process was designed to exhaust her, to make her an example of what happened when black people challenged the scientific establishment. The message was clear. You can be studied, cataloged, and measured, but you cannot speak back. Testimony is a privilege reserved for those who hold power, not those who are subject to it. Meanwhile, Morton had made his decision. In May, he published a carefully worded paper in the Proceedings of the Academy of Natural Sciences titled, On Anomalous Cranial Formations in Mixed-Race Subjects. Harriet was not named, but the measurements were there, the data from that March morning. Jests now contextualized in language that stripped away her humanity and restored the comfortable distance of scientific objectivity. He concluded that individuals of mixed racial heritage presented morphological confusion that complicated but did not invalidate existing racial classifications. The measurements became evidence not of the system's failure but of amalgamation's biological incoherence. Science had reasserted its authority, sealing Harriet Stone back into the specimen jar. And then in June 1862, Harriet Stone disappeared. Not in the dramatic sense of abduction or violence, but in the way that people on the margins have always disappeared, quietly, deliberately erasing themselves from official records to escape surveillance, prosecution, or the grinding machinery of systems designed to contain them. Her room at the boarding house was found empty one morning, rent paid through the end of the month, her few possessions gone, no forwarding address left behind. Chen told those who asked that she had family in Canada, that she had decided to take her daughter north where the war's chaos would not reach them, where the long arm of American racial science could not follow. Whether this was true, no one could say. Harriet Stone simply ceased to exist in Philadelphia's documented landscape, no census records, no city directories, just no court appearances for the lawsuit that evaporated without a defendant. Some said she went to Boston and changed her name, working as a teacher in schools for black children. Others claimed they saw her in New York, speaking at abolitionist meetings under a pseudonym, her testimony about the academy woven into larger speeches about the violence of scientific racism. There were rumors she had gone south, using her ambiguous appearance to pass as white and gather intelligence for the Union Army, a spy whose unclassifiable body became a weapon against the Confederacy. Still others insisted she had died, fever, childbirth, violence, any of the 1,000 dangers that claimed black women's lives in that brutal century, and that the stories of her survival were wishful thinking, legend-making by a community desperate for heroes. The truth was that Harriet Stone had done what millions of black people would do over the coming decades. She had refused to be legible to systems designed to control her. She had made herself a ghost, slipping between the categories, living in the spaces where official records lost their grip. But her testimony remained. The articles she had written, the speeches she had given, the account of that March morning in the academy, these circulated for years, reprinted and quoted, becoming part of the intellectual arsenal against scientific racism. Frederick Douglass cited her in an 1863 speech. Sojourner Truth referenced her testimony when challenging phrenologists who tried to measure her skull. Harriet Stone became not a person but a story, not a body but a legend, and in that transformation she achieved something the men in the academy never could do. She became uncontainable, unmeasurable, beyond the reach of their calipers and their theories. History remembers Samuel Morton's skull collection, now housed in university museums with plaques explaining their problematic origins. History remembers Agassiz's photographs of enslaved people, images so violent in their objectification that institutions still debate whether they should be displayed or destroyed. History remembers Josiah Nott's books, his lectures, his theories that poison American medicine and law for generations, justifying segregation, sterilization, immigration restrictions, and 1,000 other policies built on the fiction that human beings could be ranked by measurement. But history struggles to remember Harriet Stone, because she refused to remain where history could find her, because she understood that survival sometimes requires disappearance, that freedom sometimes means becoming illegible to the systems that seek to document and control. Yet her echo persists in every person who has ever been studied without consent, measured without dignity, reduced to data and someone else's theory of human worth. On quiet nights, in archives and libraries where old newspapers yellow and crack, researchers occasionally discover her name in footnotes and letters, fragments of a woman who existed at the intersection of too many categories to fit comfortably in any. They find the article she wrote, still shocking in its clarity and rage. They find references to her in abolitionist correspondence, in church records, in the whispered oral histories of black Philadelphia families who remember a woman who spoke back to scientists and lived to tell about it. And they understand that Harriet Stone was not an anomaly, not a biological puzzle, not evidence for or against any racial theory. She was a woman who loved her daughter enough to endure violation, who found her voice in a room designed to silence her, who turned the tools of her own objectification into weapons of testimony and resistance. The Academy of Natural Sciences still stands on Broad Street. Its marble halls now home to different exhibits, different stories, a museum that has had to reckon with its complicity in scientific racism. Somewhere in its archives, if you know where to look, you might find Morton's unpublished notes from March 14, 1862, measurements recorded in his precise hand, numbers that were supposed to prove something but proved only that human beings cannot be captured by instruments, so that dignity cannot be calibrated, that a woman standing in a column of light can shatter certainty with nothing but her voice. Harriet Stone became myth the moment she refused to be specimen, and myths, unlike data, do not fade. They whisper across centuries, reminding us that every measurement is a choice, every classification a violence, every category a cage that someone somewhere will refuse to enter. Her name was Harriet Stone. Remember her. Suggest she was never what they tried to make her, she was always more.